The agenda this week thought about think tanks and their influence on democracy. We parsed the pros and cons of physician-assisted death and considered salary caps for Ontario's public sector. The agenda's week in review begins with the dictator hunter. Our next guest has spent a lifetime bringing those charged with the worst human rights abuses to justice. Joining us now to discuss his work pursuing some of the world's worst despots, here's Reid Brody. He is counsel and spokesperson for Human Rights Watch. And it's good to have you here in Toronto.
Thank you very much.
Where's home for you?
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York.
I've lived everywhere in the world, but I just moved back to right near where I was born in Brooklyn.
Well, I don't know if they called you this on the streets of Brooklyn, but I have certainly seen references in some of the world's bigger media to you being called the dictator hunter. Why do they call you that?
Well, I've spent my career, or at least the last 15 years of it, working with victims who are trying to bring the perpetrators of atrocities, the people who tortured them or who laid waste to their country, helping them bring the perpetrators to justice. And it really began, or this phase of my work began in 1998 with the case of Augusto Pinochet, the former dictator of Chile. And in October '98, he was arrested in London on a warrant from a Spanish judge for crimes allegedly committed in Chile.
Back in the 1970s.
Back in the 1970s, exactly. And when he was arrested, I went to London. He challenged his arrest before the British courts, went up to the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. And we participated in the case, and when the House of Lords ruled that Pinochet's arrest could go forward, that he didn't have immunity, we realized that we had a tool in international justice to bring to book tyrants and torturers who seemed out of the reach of justice.
And that tool, until that moment, was not there?
The law was there, but it had never been put into practice. And it's one thing to have these things on the books, and there were many cases in which it could have happened, but it took the Pinochet case and the political will in England at the time and Spain to make it happen.
How much of a watershed case was that in terms of your overall attempts to bring justice to those who had suffered at the hands of some of the world's worst despots?
Well, it was, everything that I do now flows from that case. At the time, I famously said that the House of Lords decision was a wake-up call for dictators. But what it really was an inspiration for human rights groups and for victims around the world. And so, while Pinochet was under house arrest in London, we started getting emails and calls from, what about Suharto, and what about Stroessner, and what about so-and-so? And so we've taken up a number of those cases, and some have gone forward and some have not. But it's really that Pinochet case was an inspiration to victims around the world.
Here's Arvind Ganeshan. He leads the Business and Human Rights Division at the organization known as Human Rights Watch, and we're happy to have you here in Toronto today. Let's focus a bit now on Canada's mining and mineral extraction sector. Tell us, what reputation do those companies have that are based in Canada but do work around the world when it comes to respecting human rights?
Canada's mining companies have a generally poor reputation around the world, and there are several reasons for this. Number one is that there have been, for years now, a number of documented problems with them. The Barrick problems of sexual violence in Porgera are mirrored by problems with Hudbay and a lawsuit against it for sexual violence in Guatemala. We have done reports on smaller Canadian mining companies in places like Eritrea and elsewhere, where there have been other human rights problems, like allegations of forced labor and elsewhere. And there are several reasons for this. Number one, even though Canada is only about 0.04% of the world's population, it has, I believe, 60% of the publicly listed mining companies in the world. And roughly 37% of the international capital spent on mining comes from Canadian companies and is on Canadian activities. And the Canadian stock exchanges hold an enormous amount of mining companies. So it is a mining country. And just by virtue of numbers, there should be more problems in the mining sector in in Canada than anywhere else because there are just more mining companies here.
Sure.
But having said that, there have been a series of persistent problems. It is more likely than not in a lot of places that if there is a human rights problems, like problems with security forces or forced labor or sexual violence, which is a pronounced problem in certain places in the mining industry, that a Canadian company might be involved.
Do you think the Canadian government is an ally to you in your work, or do they tend to be more defensive of what the mining companies are up to?
For years now, the Canadian government of several stripes has actually blocked Canadian legislation that would have required Canadian mining companies to act more responsibly. That first happened 4 years ago when there was a members' bill called C-300 that would have required certain human rights disclosures and export credit agencies to take into account human rights. That failed by 6 votes. Just recently, there was another bill to create an ombudsman to oversee the mining and extractive industries to make sure that they followed human rights. That failed, and it didn't get a single Conservative vote in Parliament.
Why do you think?
I think that one of the real unfortunate realities of the Canadian extractive industries, mining in particular, but also oil, is a real resistance to meaningful standards. So you have this dichotomy where there are a series of human rights problems that have been documented, Barrick, Nevsun, Hudbay, others, around the world related to Canadian mining companies. And there have also been a series of attempts to get stronger rules in place to prevent that from happening, and the government doesn't support those rules. So what you have today is that for a Canadian company, in its own way, it is perfectly legal under Canadian law to have these problems abroad, even though there are many people that want that to change.
You've already made the case on this program that increased profitability comes with increased respect for human rights. Mm-hmm. I guess you have not been able to persuade the government of Canada, regardless of what party is in power, of the merits of that argument.
I think it is a very short-sighted approach by the government. If you take the long view, and I hope they do, this is a law that needs to happen. Now, the Canadian government has been good at passing other laws that we think are important, or supporting other laws, like a law that requires mining and oil companies to disclose the payments they make to governments, because that's a critical way to help curb corruption abroad and things like that. But on this particular issue, where there is a history of problems, and it's not new, I mean, these are front-page stories in Canada on a regular basis, and there have been long series in the newspapers and on TV and elsewhere about it. The Canadian government isn't taking the steps it can and should take to address the problem. I mean, the best outcome for the Canadian government or Canadian industry is to be seen as a leader everywhere it goes. And by not having these rules in place, when you clearly have a history of problems, you're not fulfilling that responsibility.
Jason, how do you decide what it is that the Fraser wants to focus on?
Well, that's a pretty involved process. So every year our research directors go through a process of asking academics that they work with, our senior fellow network, which is over 50 now, looking at the landscape of issues that are current this year and in the following year. And then we go through a process of collegially talking about the priorities of those projects. This year, for example, we had over 200 ideas for projects that came through our senior fellows, contracted researchers, friends, and our internal researchers primarily. And we can only do about 75 to 80. And so we go through a process of prioritizing those projects and thinking about what are the key projects, what are the important issues that we're going to deal with over the next year. And then we set that agenda, and then we go about creating a budget and hopefully raising enough money to do that kind of research and outreach over the course of the coming years.
Trish, let me ask you, when you do a report, for example, on a particular policy issue, I mean, ideally, you want to engage members of the public, you want to engage stakeholders, you want to engage politicians, opposition politicians too, others who might have an interest in the issue. But really, at the end of the day, is it all about focusing on the government?
I think it's a mix of everything there. Certainly for our focus and what we're trying to accomplish in any given strategic work here. So yeah, we'd like to know that we're influencing some government policy in a positive direction, but we also engage with civil society organizations, with social justice movements, and with academics, like I said, across the country. So at various times, a different report might try try to achieve a different aim.
But is it possible that as you cast the net wide, you may give information to social justice groups, which will then use that information to lobby government? In other words, at the end of the day, it's really all about getting a government, or maybe a cabinet minister in particular, to do what you would like them to do, isn't it?
Well, you know, our focus is on progressive public policy. So yeah, we are, in terms of that, we advocate for progressive public policy. We do we educate social movements. So we do feel like we're part of this broader democratic process where there are a number of pillars of democracy, and we as a think tank are, you know, among those pillars.
Rohinton, I think every think tank says they're nonpartisan. Are they?
Depends how you define nonpartisan.
Okay, how are you defining it?
If by nonpartisan we mean do they subscribe to a certain political party, I'd suspect most think tanks are not. But if you think of nonpartisan as where on the spectrum have you positioned yourself, then I'd say many think tanks are not nonpartisan. If I read something from the CCPA, I know I'll get a robust social democratic viewpoint. If I read something from the Fraser Institute, I know I'll get a robust market-oriented viewpoint.
How about CIGI?
In CIGI's case, we have deliberately not positioned ourselves by viewpoint. We've positioned ourselves by the issue. So what we look for are gaps in global governance, for example, sovereign debt management or managing the internet. We really don't have ways of managing these things. And then we go out and consider the different options which are ways forward. Sometimes they can be highly interventionist, other times they cannot be. So we've defined nonpartisan in a much more traditional sense, which is that you couldn't pin on CIGI a label such as right-wing or left-wing.
I mean, the public may be under the impression that think tanks, you know, pure as the driven snow, offer completely neutral advice on all of these kinds of issues that we've been talking about today, and don't come from a particular place. I mean, are there any think tanks who really operate that way, or do they all come from a place?
They all come from a place.
They do.
I mean, we can hope that the Maple Leafs make it into the playoffs, but we know what will likely happen. You can think whatever you want. The reality is they all have an ideological orientation. The Fraser Institute, which was established, the CCPA was established in response to the Fraser Institute. If you go to the U.S. experience, the Heritage Foundation, likely the most influential conservative think tank in the world, was created as a counterweight to the Brookings Institution. Exactly. Interestingly enough, the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation have worked on a number of projects together, but Jason didn't talk about that. They all have an ideological bent, and there is nothing wrong with that. That they need to come clean so the public and the media are better informed about the positions that they adopt.
I think those international alliances are really important. For instance, we work with the Center for American Progress in the States, which is a very large think tank. And in fact, I was a part of a meeting that happened in 2012 where those who wanted to start progressive think tanks in Canada were actually gathered in Washington for almost a 101 on how the Center for American Progress was developed and grew into what is a really massive organization right now. And that kind of cross-pollination of ideas is incredibly important. Political parties do it, think tanks need to do it, civil society organizations need to do that to learn from the best in class from around the world and important share ideas.
And it happens on both sides of this ideological spectrum. For conservative-leaning or market-leaning think tanks, there are also international gatherings. I've been to some very interesting ones where you exactly do this exchange of ideas, and you also see how, interestingly enough, market solutions or solutions you think are market-oriented in your country are seen by other countries perhaps as either too left or too right, and you realize the spectrum is actually much broader than you thought it probably was.
Well, how then, Dawn, is the public supposed to reliably regard the advice that it gets or that it's being asked to consider when it's clearly coming from an ideological place, even though these organizations may protest that it in fact does?
It's not easy, and my advice would be for your viewers to do a bit of background research on the organizations themselves. One thing that came up, Steve, during your discussion with the earlier panel was this notion of advocacy. And Kathleen just touched on this. The Center for American Progress and the Heritage Foundation have created separate sister organizations that engage almost completely in advocacy. So the direction in the US and around the globe is toward more advocacy and less policy research. But it's very important when viewers listen to people from think tanks that they understand where they come from, what the role of these organizations are, and the perspective that they naturally embrace. It is very, very important for them to know that.
I want to introduce someone else into this, and that's the Pope, because this past weekend he was addressing the Association of Italian Catholic Doctors, and he took the opportunity to speak out on this issue. Here's some of what the Pope said. He said, the Pope considers the assisted suicide movement as a symptom of a contemporary throwaway culture that views the sick and elderly as a drain on society. Francis, during this meeting, urged doctors to take, quote, a courageous and against the grain decisions to uphold church teaching on the dignity of life. That was published in the Telegraph by Nick Squires. James, when we look at Canadian Catholics, you've said that there wasn't, a lot of demarcations between the different demographics. But what did the Ipsos Reid poll tell us about the attitudes of Canadian Catholics on this issue?
So Catholics were 83% in favor of legalizing assisted death.
83%.
83%. It's interesting that, because Pope Francis is quite well recognized for being somebody who's very forward-thinking on a lot of social issues and has been a lot more open to things than maybe some of his predecessors have. I don't presume to give the Pope instruction, but the Pope himself has recognized that the church teaching is largely out of step with the vast majority beliefs of members of the Catholic Church, and they are currently changing their approach to Planned Family, to talking about sex education, to a variety of social topics, simply out of recognition of the fact that the official church position is just not even represented among Catholics, let alone the population as a whole.
And what does it say to you that, there seems to be some universality around this issue in Canada? We're not seeing it, break down on sort of tradition, cultural or religious lines.
Well, I was born a Catholic and I listen to everything the Pope says. But I think what he's saying and what he said there isn't in line with what people were asked here. People were asked a very specific question. They were asked about people who were terminally ill, who were suffering unbearably, and who wanted to end their lives. And I think that is something very different. That is not anything to do with a throwaway culture that doesn't take any care with the meaning of life. That's something different. And I think if you ask almost anybody that sort of question, you'll get the results you get, because
you seem to be hinting that you don't believe that this large proportion, this large majority of Canadians actually supports physician-assisted death. You're saying
No, I do. I apologise if that's what it seems like I said. I think they do support it in very demarcated conditions. But I think that sometimes what happens with the discussion is we start very demarcated, unbearable suffering, terminally ill, competent to make a decision, and ask them repeatedly to end their lives. And then we get it starts to get bigger and bigger, and then we're saying that there are other groups who can make the same sort of decisions. And, what about people with chronic mental illness? What about people with chronic physical conditions who aren't terminally ill? And then it starts expanding. And I think when it starts expanding, then I think it gets more fuzzy very quickly.
Can I just jump in on that? Because actually it's good that you brought that up, Kwame. The Ipsos Reid poll actually did include a number of other scenarios as questions. And in fact, of the response, virtually every scenario still had a majority support, including situations like the ones you just described. So yeah, the level certainly went down for other indications.
It went down to about 60%.
It went into the 60s.
It went into the 60s, and that's where you start getting significant differences between different groups.
If I could jump in on that point as well. When I was putting the legislation together, I obviously went and did some discussions with various stakeholder groups, including the religious community. And I did a roundtable in Winnipeg with the Christian community, Protestants right across the spectrum, and Catholics. And while, the Protestants were generally in favor, as you might expect, or maybe not, but what really shocked me was that the Catholic father, when it came to him, he said he supported physician-assisted death, and I I was, well, doctor, you're not really pulling the party line on that. And his reply was, most of his ministry is bedside palliative care, end-of-life ministry, and he's seen so much suffering that he cannot imagine that that is God's will. That says a lot.
Let me go to Susan, because I know you wanted Susan, then I'll come back to the table here. Susan, go ahead. These guys are fighting to talk.
Yeah, I'm just too far away. One of the things we've been talking about a lot is suffering, and I'm certainly not an expert on the nature of suffering, but a couple of things come to mind when we're talking about this, and I've mentioned that we do have better symptom management than we ever did before. But one of the things that concerns me is that so many patients across our country don't have access to specialized palliative care services. And you know, one of the statistics that keeps being quoted is that only 30% of Canadians have access to specialized palliative care. And I think that's one of the drivers, perhaps, of this feeling of we have to have assisted suicide or euthanasia, is because people are suffering and they don't have access to the kinds of services that could quite likely be of significant help. I think the other thing is that we really need to have a significant change in the attitude of healthcare providers. Just because we're able to do something doesn't mean we should do something. And there's a whole movement about called the Choosing Wisely program, and James would know about this, where decisions about what kinds of treatments we ought to have are being thrown out so that people can think a little bit more clearly about making correct choices. Should I have that surgery? Should I have a feeding tube put in? What are the consequences of doing that? I would hope that as we move forward, one of the silver linings out of this whole discussion about assisted suicide is that the general public starts to think a little bit more carefully and questions their clinicians about the treatments that they're being offered. Really, should I have that fourth-line chemotherapy? What are the benefits from it? What are the downsides of it? What will I get out of it? Should I really have that treatment, that surgery or whatever? Those kinds of things really need to start happening a little bit more.
Let's talk about the sort of common argument against imposing any sort of restriction on wages, and that is that you don't attract the best and the brightest, that they will choose to work in the private sector where they can be compensated to a level which they think is acceptable. I want to get all of you in on this. Catherine, why don't you start me off?
So that's why our private members bill, Bill 136, actually built in a caveat. So, you know, if you're a nuclear physicist, if you're the CEO of a nuclear institution, and that is a skill set that warrants an additional, salary upgrade, then fine. So, but you have to have a starting place. You have to, otherwise, you're
But the starting place is sort of just fake. Like if you say, okay, well, it's 418, but you can go up to that. You can negotiate that if you're a nuclear physicist.
Well, I don't think so. I think you have to have a place to start to negotiate from, because the broader public sector. I mean, we are seeing salaries as high as $1.7 million in the public sector, versus on the lower scale, the frontline workers that the Conservatives think everybody should be frozen. Personal support workers are only making $12 to $14 an hour. You cannot apply the same scale and scope to all public sector. We're talking primarily about a burgeoning middle management and high bureaucrats like CEOs and executives. And you have to have a hard cap in order to negotiate a hard cap.
Well, let me come to you. Are we going to lose our best and brightest by putting on these kind of caps?
Well, I think certainly you run the risk of doing that. People will go where the money is. But I think at the end of the day, we've said this very consistently, you have to live within a budget. You have to, the taxpayer pays the bill here. And at times you've got to live.
But the taxpayer also probably wants the best and the brightest.
Well, you do want the best, but you have to be able to afford the best. And again, right now, the Liberals have doubled our debt. We've got that staring us in the face every day. So, to Catherine's point, if someone wants $1.7 million, we may not be able to afford $1.7 million.
Okay, in the good times, should we then not have salary caps? I mean, if we're not running a deficit?
Absolutely. I think what we should be doing is reviewing all of these agencies. We again have called for a program review of everything. What is the cost? What we really like to do, to be honest, is to get the detail out of most of these things. Catherine and I were talking before the show started. The Liberals brought out the Transparency and Accountability Act and time allocated it. I mean, how hypocritical is that? We've tried to bring Laura Miller and Peter Feist from the gas plant scandal, $1 billion loss, and we can't get that. So we have to be looking at things in the broadest scale we possibly can and really get to the root of the issues. And the salary cap is a small sliver, I think, from Martin's perspective. I agree with that. And we need to be looking at everything and getting our province back in shape. And that's going to make some decisions that have to be done at this time.
Small sliver, but powerful symbolism. And people forget that Chris Mazza not only earned about $1.4 million a year plus bonuses, plus a smoothie every day at 3 o'clock. And I'd like to see that in the legislation, please, when they get down to the details. But a smoothie cap, a hard cap on the smoothies, perhaps. But the question of what's the right amount is a good one. And I think while I have to confess in my moments of weakness, I was attracted to the NDP's idea of a double the premier. The problem with that is that a lot of the lower paid salary hospitals in smaller communities might also tend to move up towards that cap. The cap becomes the floor. So what's useful about this legislation or this proposal is the idea to do some serious comparators, to look not just at the private sector, which is kind of the reflex, well, they're getting this much in the private sector, but look also at other public sector comparisons in other jurisdictions. It's not useful to compare a hospital administrator to somebody who works at a bank, or to say that so-and-so has to be paid this amount of money, or the best and the brightest, which is a phrase, I remind you, that was used ironically in the 1960s. They thought they were the best and the brightest, but they were a bit precocious. Look, people are always going to be poached, but I think the chances of somebody at a small or medium-sized hospital being poached by some big facility in Dubai or in Texas is something we're just going to have to live with. There are a lot of public service-minded people who would be happy to work at a cancer center or a hospital at less than $420,000 or less than $700,000 or even $1 million a year, as some of our hospital executives are paid. Look, I asked someone at one of the other ministries which are more poachable about how they deal with it, because there are people in the finance ministry, for example, who are prone to poaching, or at OPG, the nuclear geniuses and so on. And you know what? Sometimes you just have to run that risk, and you can't keep them there for an entire career. And maybe you will have higher staff turnover in some of these more intricate ministries. And maybe you have to reward them and give them higher promotions and bigger, more interesting, challenging opportunities. But we can't always compete with some of these private sector compensation committees who think people are worth $1 million. They aren't always.
Well, I also think it raises the point that this is all about money, that people only go to jobs for money. And I think that's something that we all make individual and choices with our families on.
I completely reject that premise. I mean, I also reject the idea that money buys you quality. I mean, the CEO of the Pan Am Games had cost overruns, projects were behind, the overall scope of the work was in question, and he was making $480,000 a year, a great job by all accounts, and then he was rewarded for doing a bad job by getting a $532,000 severance. And people have no patience for that, and nor should they. But let me be very clear. This piece of legislation will not rectify that wrong on the parts of the people of this province.
Okay, let's just stick with that for a minute, because I think, well, you two are definitely making this point, that this whole exercise, the fact that there's wiggle room, that it sort of negates this idea of even trying to go down this road. I mean, should the Liberals have just said, we're not even going to touch this one?
No, I think it's a good idea. I think we've said already they have to go beyond chapter headings to the details. I frankly wonder what they've been doing for the last few decades. If they haven't done this kind of hard work of doing the comparators and so on, what on earth are they using as the basis for paying people today? One of the questions I have about this legislation is they're not just going for the people who are earning $400,000 or $1 million. They're going for anybody above $100,000. So I don't know how broadly they're going to cast the net. This is for supervisory staff or executive staff is the phrasing that they use. But I think we all tend to focus on the CEO, the big cheese. The medium cheeses also can make a lot of money at some of these bigger organizations. And so the vice president at certain of the hospitals in downtown Toronto make also hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they're also going to be captured in this legislation, and that's a good idea.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety if you want. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.